Tonight, the US says it supports waiving intellectual property protection for COVID vaccines to help low-income countries. What difference could this make? We get reaction to President Biden's move from the pharma industry and from the former Foreign Secretary David Miliband, who joins us live. Also tonight, voters head to the polls tomorrow. Does left and right still count? What's the picture in the West Midlands? And what's on your mind, Donald? The Facebook judgment, which will keep the former president off its platform. Hello, good evening. What does it take to treat the vaccination of the economically developing world as seriously as we do our own countries? Tonight, we might be on the first step to an answer. The US has said it will support a proposal to waive intellectual property protections, ownership for COVID-19 vaccines, joining an effort to increase global supply to narrow the gap between rich and poor nations. The US Trade Representative Catherine Tai told Bloomberg News tonight America was in favour of the waiver and what it was trying to achieve. Her words now need to be followed up with a concrete plan for what it means and how it happens. But it is likely to put pressure on other nations, including our own, to follow suit. The IP waiver has been opposed by drug makers who say the plan is ineffective. They argue that few countries have the capacity to produce more vaccines, even if they knew the formulas, and that there's still a limited global supply of materials needed. Well, let's talk to Nick Watt about what all this could mean, Nick. Just talk us through what we've heard and where it goes.
Well, Emily, this potentially has huge ramifications. You mentioned the US Trade Representative Catherine Tai just there, and just listen to her language. She's saying, look, we strongly believe in intellectual property protection. That's protecting the rights, the brains and the money of the companies that have developed these vaccines. Completely understand that. But then she went on to say the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic require extraordinary measures. Now, there's been a huge debate about getting the World Trade Organization to waive what are called the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. That's known as TRIPS. The advocates for that say, look at Brazil and India. Look at the developing world. 1.1 billion COVID vaccines administered so far across the world, only 18 million in Africa. On the other side, you've got countries like the UK and the EU, supported by the pharmaceutical companies, raising concerns, saying, well, maybe you could hand over novel technology to China and to Russia. On their side, they have Bill Gates, the great philanthropist. He said, look, this idea is not going to speed up the distribution of vaccines. His idea is that financial donations are the best way of going about this. Now, Newsnight has done a lot on this. Last week, we had Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland, saying that this waiver is necessary. She's the head of the Elders, that's the former world leaders. And Joe Biden, he is facing an awful lot of pressure on his left in the Democratic Party, very keen on this. But of course, the World Trade Organization tends to work on consensus, and there isn't a consensus on this over there.
That's going to be tricky, isn't it? Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, in a moment, we'll be hearing from Richard Torbitt from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. But first to David Miliband, Chief Executive Officer of the International Rescue Committee, now resident in New York. David Miliband, do you think this is the game changer that it sounds, or is it just a sort of a nice gesture towards it?
I think that it's part of the puzzle for getting out of the current COVID crisis. I'm sitting on the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response, which is reporting next week. And it's clear that there are three major aspects of this that need to be addressed with incredible urgency. First of all, the redistribution of the vaccines from the rich world to the poorer parts of the world. Estimates of 2 billion excess orders in richer parts of the world. So there's a redistribution part of this. Secondly, once the vaccines get to the poorer parts of the world, they need to be distributed effectively. We can't have them sitting in storehouses, the sort of places that the International Rescue Committee works. Cold chains are an enormous challenge. So you need to get the distribution right. And then thirdly, there's production. And this is where the vaccine move that the Biden administration have taken is so significant, because production needs to be significantly ramped up. And I think it's very significant that the Biden administration should have followed their words about war footing on the domestic front, the need to tackle COVID on the domestic front with a huge effort. They're now matching that globally because they recognise that business as usual will not make the world safe.
I mean, I guess the UK government could argue that actually they'd already given the world AstraZeneca, that it was already done at cost price and that there was no money, real money, being made from this. And so it doesn't have to follow suit in the same way that the US has done. Does that work as an argument?
Well, I think it could say that, but it would be unwise for a couple of reasons. First of all, the UK does have a good record of donating to COVAX. That's welcome. But it's obviously battling the reputational and substantive damage of the aid cuts that are being announced and that are doing a lot of harm to Britain's reputation as a serious global player. Now, with the Biden administration having thrown its weight behind this temporary waiver, which needs to be negotiated through the World Trade Organization, I think it's very important both to get the work done, but also in the British national interest to be part of the solution to this. I'd be saying, if I was in government, look, there are details that need to be worked on, but rather than standing outside the room and saying, no, 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 we should be inside the room making sure this is done in an effective way. Because the history of health efforts in this area, for example, if you look at some of the medicines where there have been some similar waivers in respect of HIV, I understand it, obviously not a vaccine case, but a medicine case, it's worked well. And we've managed to make that those waivers part of the ramping up of production, which is so important alongside the redistribution and the effective distribution in poorer countries that's so important.
Isn't it interesting, though, to hear Bill Gates, really at the forefront of global vaccination, be so anti this as a solution? He says financial donation is by far the best way, not this.
Well, it's both and, not either or. I think Bill Gates I saw certainly one of the interviews he did about this, and he said, don't present this as a panacea. And he's absolutely right. That's why I'm emphasising the urgent need to get on with the redistribution of the 2 billion excess doses, to make sure that once these vaccines do reach the poorer countries, we've got effective distribution systems so that the whole of those countries is covered. And I don't think this is a matter of making the best the enemy of the good. It's a matter of recognising that we are in the middle of the most unbelievable global crisis. We've been landed here after a series of reports over the last 20 years have warned of the dangers of a pandemic, and there was no political leadership. Now is the time for political leadership, and that's what I think President Biden is determined to offer. And I think it's incumbent on the British government to join him rather than standing on the side.
Let's pick up with Dr. Richard Torbitt, who represents British pharmaceutical industries. And we did, I should say, ask the government to come onto the show. They couldn't be with us. But Dr. Torbitt, when you hear the excitement there is about this, not as a panacea, but as one part of the solution, do you embrace it?
What I completely embrace is the desperate need to ramp up manufacturing as quickly as possible and to do everything that we possibly can to find the right solutions to get these vaccines to everyone in the world that needs them. I actually agree with much of what I've just heard from David Miliband. I think now is the time for really strong political leadership. I was very, very pleased to see the G7 communique today that was made it really clear from the G7 governments about the financial commitment to COVAX as a multilateral mechanism for dealing with vaccines access. This is incredibly important, and we want to be very, very much part of this solution. But honestly, we're genuinely worried about this IP issue.
Because?
We're worried about it for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think it's important to note that we've gone from 0 vaccines to, in 2021, if all goes well with all the regulatory approvals, we'll have over 10 billion doses already. So actually, we are producing at a massive, massive scale right now. And the companies have done that because they are voluntarily seeking agreements with manufacturers around the world that are credible and that have the skills, that have the equipment, that have the knowledge to be able to do the technology transfer to produce safe and effective medicines. Now, our worry is that if you waive IP, you could find yourself in a situation, we could find ourselves in a situation where scarce supplies that are desperately needed to keep that manufacturing going could end up in companies that might not know what they're doing. And that will be really damaging for confidence.
Let me just go back to David Miliband on that one, that you relinquish quality control, in essence.
Well, I think the key is that you don't. And that's why President Biden is proposing detailed negotiations and regulation to ensure that the dangers that the doctor suggests do not come about. And I think that's very important that we're round the table making sure that the details are properly worked out. And it's worth remembering that there has been significant R&D privately funded, but it was underwritten by government commitments, notably actually by the Trump administration, surprisingly to many people, that guaranteed and support so that the private sector manufactured at risk. In other words, they started manufacturing these vaccines before they knew whether they would work, so that when they were given regulatory approval, they were able to be rolled out quickly. And so this has been a public-private partnership all the way through. The voluntary licensing that the doctor refers to is very important. So are the issues of technology transfer. But this isn't going to be the last dangerous pandemic we face. We need to forestall the next one. And so the arguments here about how we get on to the right kind of war footing for a global challenge of this kind are going to be important, not just for this crisis, but going forward.
Richard Torbitt, there is a danger, I guess, that the pharmaceutical industry looks like it's protecting its own here, that some of the companies have seen their shares fall on this news, and it looks as if they're putting up the citadel on the very idea.
Yeah, of course that's how it will look to many people. And all I can say to you is that this is really not about the money. Although, of course, I think the point about planning for future pandemics is a material issue here, because, of course, we need these companies to keep investing and keep preparing themselves for the tomorrow, keep adapting to new variants of the current virus and planning for the next ones. But I'm completely realistic about the pharmaceutical industry's role in this debate. It's critically important that all of the companies are responsible, are going the extra mile. The companies need to provide leadership just as the politicians do.
Okay.
And I think, look, we want to keep talking. There is no doubt that the industry will keep talking to the Biden administration about this and what checks and balances can be put in place to manage the risk.
All right.
It is a genuine risk that there'll be consequences for this. But it's a complicated problem, and the solutions will also be complicated and not simple.
We're out of time, but thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening. Now, what drives the way we vote? Is it heartstrings or purse strings? Is it faith in what we're told or a distrust of those in positions of power? Is it tribal or untested, trivial or force of habit? Tomorrow, we'll see the biggest democratic exercise in terms of the number of individual races ever held in this country. Local elections, Scottish, Welsh parliaments, mayoral contests and police commissioners. The only part of the UK that will not be voting is Northern Ireland. In a moment, we'll be looking at the big electoral trends we've seen over the last 2 decades. Before that, in the last of his series, our political editor, Nick Watt, has been in the West Midlands.
A city and a region that once powered a global revolution. A city then down on its luck as Birmingham and the wider Black Country struggled with the decline of heavy industries. Now a region hoping, if not exactly to recreate past glories, then at least to hold its head high again as gleaming new buildings attest to a new era. And today the West Midlands, where voters will be choosing their Metro Mayor tomorrow, found itself at the heart of British politics. First Boris Johnson, plus his candidate.
One more. We'll take that.
And then Keir Starmer, plus candidate, visiting in the final precious hours before polling. A keenly fought contest for the mayoral post, which was narrowly won at its inception in 2017 by the Tories. It's a crown Labour need to capture. 2 leaders in one region within the space of a few hours. But it's Sir Keir Starmer who enters these elections facing some of the greatest political pressures. He must show that his rupture with Jeremy Corbyn is producing dividends at the ballot box. And that is no more so than in the West Midlands mayoral contest. Unless Labour can wrest back control of this former urban heartland, it will struggle to win back power at a national level. The last time Labour won a general election in 2005, it almost won a clean sweep in the West Midlands, 23 of the 28 parliamentary seats. At the last general election in 2019, the 4th in a row lost by Labour, the party could only manage half of the parliamentary seats, 14 out of 28.
Thanks a lot. Cheers. Nice to see you guys. I'll give you one of them. Take care, mate. See you guys.
the Labour candidate and former Cabinet Minister Liam Byrne detects a change.
What is so interesting when you spend all day, every day on the doorstep is you see the way that people now think of Labour differently. So, you know, we can now park outside of a pub, get the Labour activists out, and people will kind of come over and say, oh, Labour, yes, give us some of the leaflets, we'll put them out in the bar. I can tell you, I didn't have that experience a couple of years ago.
Now, Keir Starmer is no Jeremy Corbyn, but he's a bit lacklustre, isn't he?
Well, I think people respect Keir for the intelligence and the ability to expose Boris. So you look, we're the party of education, education, education. The Tories have become the party of decoration, decoration, decoration. So people have actually, when we've taken Keir Starmer out in markets or on high streets here, it's so interesting to watch people's reaction, because people actually want to come over and have a proper conversation.
So yeah, welcome to Wolverhampton, Nick. So the station is a brand new station, about £50 million coming from the combined authority.
Keen to highlight investment, the Conservative incumbent says he is upholding the tradition of the Tory champion of regional government.
So it could be said I'm doing this job very much as Michael Heseltine envisaged it, perhaps in two ways. First of all, I'm pretty non-partisan in how I've gone about it. So yes, of course, I'm proud to be a Conservative, but I've tried to bring together parties across the region. But the other thing I've tried to do is be really business-like about it, so to put the cases to government and indeed to the private sector for investments.
Not an original fan of Boris Johnson, Andy Street has worked hard to build strong relations with Number 10. But then there's the small matter of John Lewis, which he used to head. People like to shop in John Lewis, people aspire to shop in John Lewis. And if you're looking down at John Lewis, you're looking down at the aspirational classes.
So you can say whatever you want about Boris's fiancée's taste. What really matters is what's happening here on the ground. And the simple point is, with a Conservative government, a Conservative mayor and Conservative councils across the West Midlands, we are actually fulfilling those aspirations of young people here.
Everyone's got all your leaflets out now?
Yes. Well, we've still got
Across the region in leafy Solihull, once a Liberal Democrat seat, a party seeking to mend fences with voters after a bruising experience in government. And now some radical thinking. Time for a minimum income.
There's a big disparity between the wealthiest across the region and the poorest, and we're seeing so many people who are actually, you know, in poverty, struggling to put a roof over their heads, to feed their children, and, you know, to feel just safe walking around the region. So we have to tackle those underlying inequalities. I mean, yes, of course we need jobs because we need employment for people, but we still need the basic level of support for everyone. So one of the things I'm proposing is a universal basic income trial, which will give everybody a basic level of income for all across the region. And that really stops people struggling and being left in poverty.
Growth in recent years for the Greens in the West Midlands. They're hearing the right noises on climate from the bigger parties, but believe there is only one way to guarantee real change.
I think there is a well-known phenomenon called the green in the room phenomenon, and we've seen this over many years now. We've got almost 400 councillors in councils across England, and we know that as soon as we win the trust of residents to represent them, and we start to be able to bring that green perspective to those conversations in town halls, in council chambers, very quickly we start to see the direction of travel changing, and it moves away from that, like I said before, essentially greenwashing, into something that's far more serious and far more meaningful.
A distinctive call from the Reform Party. Ease lockdown restrictions now and think beyond the big metropolis.
Of course, we need jobs. I mean, one of the main things that I'm arguing for is hospitality must open now, because there are people, the other candidates talk about young people and how much they care about them. I'm saying, well, you'd open hospitality now because that's where a lot of young people work. It's not all about HS2, it's not all about Birmingham city centre. It needs to be about the whole region, reinvigorating the towns that are scattered, that have been left behind.
A familiar sight of deserted city centre offices. And, as the seasons change, tranquility in the UK's second city. But this region's political voice may soon tell us about the wider direction of this country.
Nick, what there? Well, the electoral map from 2 decades ago is almost unrecognisable from the one we see now. It was 16 years ago today that the UK last voted for a Labour government. In that time, we've seen the financial crash, further devolution in the nations, the Brexit vote and, of course, a year of pandemic. How have these seismic changes redrawn the map? Lewis Goodall is taking a look for us now. Lewis.
Yes, indeed, Emily. Of course, we will have plenty of time, believe me, to dissect and ingest and interpret the results of the very exciting election results in the days to come. But for now, it is worth considering the big picture of how our electoral politics has been changing over the long term. For instance, as both Emily and Nick were saying, 16 years ago today, the country, remember this guy, voted in the 2005 general election, the last election, of course, to return a Labour government. And let's take a look at the electoral map that emerged from that election. The swathes of Labour red, not only in Scotland, but in England, what we now call the Red Wall. Lib Dem, gold, woven throughout the country, particularly in the southwest. The Tories, still largely the party of the English Shires, only 199 seats in that election. But it was after the 2005 election, though, that things began to change. And the elections tomorrow will be the latest staging post of that story. Now, although tomorrow's votes, of course, aren't about Westminster, it is nonetheless instructive to look at those elections as a guide. We talk a lot about the transformation in Scotland and much less about England. So let's have a look at English vote share in general elections over time. Look at this picture. Continued Conservative strengthening over time. They've added votes in each and every general election since 2001. 2005 is the inflection point. After that, as you can see, Labour is overtaken by the Conservatives in England, and that far predates Brexit. Labour does a bit better in 2017, of course, but generally it's a negative picture. And in each election, as other parties come and go, the Lib Dems, Green, UKIP, which we can't see there, but they did very well. Nonetheless, the Tories get stronger and stronger, absorbing much of the former UKIP vote on the right and slowly becoming hegemonic across much of England. That is, apart from in one place, London. We talk so much about the Red Wall, we talk far less about what's happened in London. So let's have a look at the general election results in London in terms of seats over time. The Tories used to have a majority of seats in London. Go back to 1992, ahead of Labour. Back in 2005, some of their recovery started to come from London. But today, that couldn't be further from the truth, from the case. Labour is completely dominant. And again, this was happening even before Brexit. Even in 2019, a complete wipeout for Labour across the country. The party did better in London than it did in 2005 in Tony Blair. These are Labour's new heartlands, and that is why Sadiq Khan, of course, is favoured for the London mayoralty and to be re-elected on Thursday. But where the Tories have sacrificed in London, they've gained elsewhere, as Nick was saying. For example, look at the West Midlands. Labour dominates even in 2005, much better than the Conservatives in the West Midlands in 2005. But slowly but surely, look at those blue graphs. Slowly but surely, the Tories gain in strength and strength and strength. And now, look at 2019, completely dominance in the region. Again, this predates Brexit, though you can see the process is rather put on steroids in 2017 and 19. And this picture is repeated in places like the Northwest or Yorkshire and to some extent the Northeast as well. And of course, the flip side to this might be that if Labour were gaining elsewhere as well, there were a realignment in that direction, then there would be less of a problem. But the problem for them is, outside of London and the cities generally, there has been no equivalent realignment in the Tory heartland. For example, the southeast of England. Let's have a look at their vote share over time. You can see the Tory vote share over time, going back all the way to 1992 and beyond, hasn't weakened, even through Brexit, and despite the fact parts of the southeast were a little bit more Remainy and there were few more graduates there, etc. Labour did benefit a bit when the Lib Dems collapsed, but they're still basically nowhere. Now, of course, that might change over time in the future, but for the moment, we seem to be a long way away from a sort of equivalent realignment for Labour in the south of England, as many seats in the north and Midlands do start to reorient against them. And this is partly because while Conservatives have increasingly come to dominate among working class voters, they've held on to most of their wealthier voters too. Look at this. This is the voting patterns of the richest voters in 2005 and 2019. You can see in those two elections and in between, the Tories maintain their sizable lead. In fact, they build on it from 2005 to 19. But then if we look at working class voters, where Labour was absolutely dominant, you can see back in 2005, really huge lead. You can see by 2019, the Tories overtook Labour. Unthinkable a decade and a half before. And of course, we know what's happening in England. In Scotland, the picture has transformed to an even greater extent. Here are the percentage of parliamentary votes for Scottish parliamentary elections since 1999. In this case, you can see 2007 was the inflection point, the Scottish parliamentary elections of that year. The SNP just by a smidgen narrowly overtake Labour. Gradually after that, gradually come to absorb much of their voter base over the coming decade. And of course, we'll get more on that in the coming days. So remember, these are some of the big themes, the big picture. Remember it when we're thinking about the elections on Thursday. As I say, they are the latest staging post of a wider and longer story which predates even Brexit, increasing Conservative strength in England and Wales, a realignment in the North and Midlands in favour of the Tories, but no equivalent realignment for Labour in the South, or at least not enough of one to hugely really benefit them yet. And in Scotland, a political situation which is now so divorced from the rest of the country that it no longer really even makes sense to talk about British politics or a British electoral landscape at all.
Lewis, thanks very much indeed. Lewis Goodall with more tomorrow. To Jersey now, which is facing threats from France in a row over post-Brexit fishing rights. The British government sent 2 offshore patrol vessels to monitor the situation after French fishers promised to blockade the ports in the Channel Islands in an escalating row. Yesterday, the French Maritime Minister backed calls to cut off Jersey's electricity supply. Residents of the Channel Islands did not get a vote in the EU referendum in 2016, the Brexit vote, but they now find themselves on the front line of the very decisions that ensued from it. Well, Mark Urban is our diplomatic editor, here to explain more. Do you think it's just about fishing rights then, Mark?
Well, that's how it started last Friday with this award of licences to 41 French boats to fish. The French responded very angrily. Firstly, they'd expected a lot more licences. Secondly, they felt that those that had got them were not being allowed enough days. This escalated very quickly. As you mentioned, the Maritime Minister raising this possibility in Paris yesterday of cutting off the electricity which comes from the French grid for most of their use in Jersey. So the politics of this moment, a lot of people, of course, tonight pointing to the fact these ships are being sent on the eve of elections in the UK, but also pretty febrile French electoral politics are contributing.
Yeah, what difference do you think those boats will make?
Well, potentially, it's got to be handled quite delicately. There's talk among the French fishermen of sending 100 fishing vessels tomorrow to Jersey. Not clear that they are going to attempt to blockade the port, but were those Royal Navy vessels to try and put themselves between the French and the port or to try and prevent a blockade, clearly the thing can escalate quite quickly. So both governments are saying that they want to cool this down, but tomorrow's going to be fascinating. Mark,
thanks very much indeed. Well, we're joined now by Ian Gorst, Jersey Government's External Relations Minister. Ian Gorst, I think I'm right in saying you spoke to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson this evening. What did you discuss and what are you expecting tomorrow?
Well, we take these threats from both Paris and the French fishermen very seriously. They are disproportionate to the issues that are being experienced in the post-Brexit trade licensing issuing. We spoke to the Prime Minister. He told us that he was foursquare behind us in standing up to those threats, and he offered to send the 2 patrol vessels as a precautionary measure to monitor the waters, and we were grateful for his support.
A lot of Jersey fishermen think you brought this on yourself. Don Thompson from the Jersey Fishermen's Association told us that you'd capitulated to the French government and the EU at every turn. He said allowing them to fish freely in the sea whilst waiting for those licences to come through. And he pointed to 1,500 tonnes of scallops that the French had fished and sold, whilst Jersey fisher people were feeling incredibly left out of the whole system.
Well, fishing is a divisive topic, and temperatures run high and feelings run high. But the new trade deal is a change from the old relationship that we had with France under something called the Bay of Granville Agreement. And it is, as we expected, proving difficult to move to this new relationship. But we think it's in the best interests of Jersey fishermen and French fishermen and the sustainability of our waters into the longer term.
When you talk about the new relationship, of course, your residents didn't get a vote. Do you feel that this was done above your heads? Did you have a say at the table as to how it was worked out, or do you feel a bit stitched up?
Well, of course, it was negotiated between the United Kingdom government and the European Union, but we had input into those negotiating positions. We were very clear with the UK government the policies that we would like to see delivered, and we are now living and trading under the terms of the new trade deal.
A lot of focus on Jersey tonight. What do you think those two patrol boats are actually going to do? What are they there for, in your opinion?
Well, they are there as a precautionary measure. We hope that the French vessels that come are protesting, and it's a peaceful protest. We absolutely accept their right to protest because they are not happy with the outcome of that trade deal. But we do take very seriously a threat to blockade the main harbour of Jersey, and therefore we are grateful for the support of the British government.
You don't really think the French are about to turn off your electricity, do you?
Well, of course, that's a commercial contract between EDF and the Jersey Electricity Company. Even the threat to do so was disproportionate to the issues that we've got around licensing. But should it happen, in extremis, we are able to generate all of our electricity on island, but we don't expect that to happen.
Ian Gorst, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
How does a country that has free speech baked into its DNA, not to mention its constitution, deal with a powerful figure whose repeated lies that can provoke violence? The question perhaps lies at the heart of the decision social media companies took in the hours and days after the attempted insurrection on Washington's Capitol building and the former president's encouragement to his own supporters to overturn the election result. Facebook, you'll remember, banned him indefinitely, Twitter permanently. But today came clarification in the form of a judgment from what's called the Facebook Oversight Board. Trump, they decided, would remain off the platform for now, but the status would be reviewed at intervals. It raises questions about the wisdom of banning a powerful figure from being able to speak their mind, and what, if any, role social media has in stopping that kind of speech there. Where do they go from here? James Clayton reports.
What did the Capitol Hill rioters have in common? A zealot-like love of Donald Trump, sure, but what was also noticeable was how many rioters were recording what they were doing. It was performative, designed for platforms like Facebook. Trump's use of social media is almost impossible to disentangle with Trumpism itself. It was his way of communicating directly with Americans, bypassing the mainstream media that he so loathed. Although Mr. Trump is best known for being on Twitter, it's Facebook where his real political power lay, a hugely important campaign tool. But did he also use that platform to radicalise? Were his posts in part responsible for these deadly riots? Facebook boss Mark Zuckerberg thought Trump's post could lead to further violence and suspended Donald Trump indefinitely the day after the riots. Twitter went one step further and banned Mr. Trump forever. He'll never be allowed back onto that platform. However, Facebook asked its decision to be reviewed by its newly formed oversight board, which it claims is independent. It's designed to make difficult moderation decisions, and their decision today was complex. It said that the Oversight Board has upheld Facebook's decision to suspend Mr. Trump's access to post content on Facebook and Instagram. However, it also said that Facebook couldn't ban Trump indefinitely. The company must reassess this penalty, it said, within 6 months of this decision. The judgment does leave a way back for Trump on Facebook, but for now the door is firmly closed. And that is a huge problem for Donald Trump and his hopes of a political return. In a statement, the former president lashed out, saying Facebook was an embarrassment to our country, and they and other social media companies must pay a political price. Facebook has been essential to Mr. Trump. His campaign used it to raise money and micro-target voters.
He spent more than $200 million in 2020 between his campaign and his PAC on Facebook advertising. He didn't spend $200 million on Twitter advertising or other social media advertising. He spent that on Facebook. So it's not just an opinion that Facebook was an essential part of his political power. He was actually one of the few places where he was putting his money where his mouth was.
The Oversight Board will uphold the ban on Donald Trump.
Republicans are angry. They believe that Facebook and other social media platforms have gone too far, stifling free speech. This was Mr. Trump's former chief of staff earlier talking on Fox News.
So this is a sad day for America, but a sadder day for the Facebooks of the world who have actually enjoyed a very wild, wild west kind of regulatory environment. I can tell you that's going to change.
The problem that Facebook has here in San Francisco is that it's not just Republicans that are calling for the company to be split up.
Anybody in here a little worried about how Facebook uses your data?
Many Democrats think Facebook is also a monopoly, and far from stifling free speech, it in fact doesn't do enough to stop hate speech. The idea of Facebook being cleaved off from Instagram has been raised as a possible punishment.
Consign him and those who supported him in the Senate to the trash heap of history.
Twitter permanently banning the commander-in-chief's personal account with 88 million followers.
Mr. Trump yesterday released his own communications platform. You can share his content from the website on Facebook and Twitter. It's the former president's attempt to get around the ban. And he's also talked of launching his own social media platform, Trumpbook perhaps. But it's really no replacement for being on Twitter or Facebook. At the click of a button, Mr. Trump could beam himself onto the computers and phones of tens of millions of Americans. That button has now gone, perhaps forever. And that could have huge ramifications for a potential tilt at the presidency in 2024.
James Clayton there. Well, we can talk to Shashan Zubov, Professor Emeritus of Harvard Business School, author of The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Shashan, do you think this was the right response from the Oversight Board, and do you think they got there in the right way?
Well, look, the Oversight Board was a creation of Facebook, not just newly formed, but actually funded by Facebook, $130 million to create it. And it's really a kind of PR device to help the company maintain this world that it's been living in without public law, without any kind of regulation. What happened today with their so-called decision was, we know that Facebook for many years indulged and appeased Mr. Trump with his increasingly incendiary messages on Facebook, because really it's an act of political appeasement. They're afraid of regulation, afraid of alienating Trump and his conservative allies. So Facebook really did very little over the many years and all those months leading up to the election when they could and should have acted. What this so-called Oversight Board did today was to kick the can back to Facebook.
Right.
To say to Facebook, what you did was unclear, it was vague, it really didn't correspond to your rule book, so you should take another look at it and figure it out in a way that actually corresponds to your rule book.
I mean,
so
you call it... Sorry, you call it a PR device, but it doesn't look as if it's working spectacularly well when you have this pincer movement of both left and right now telling you that Facebook's not functioning.
Well, what this comment and today really illustrates, Facebook is, chasing this committee that it created, looking for a way of covering up its lack of solutions, asking them for some kind of decision. And the Oversight Board is chasing Facebook. So you've got these folks, I picture them chasing each other on the rim of a donut. And the problem is they're looking for solutions, but the solution space is in the hole. And the real message that is uncovered by this bizarre situation today is that the only real solution for Facebook and the rest of social media, and indeed the tech sector, is that finally we as democracies must decide, and I mean citizens and lawmakers, we must decide how should communication work in this unprecedented medium that we call the internet.
Well,
we need a way of creating the rights and the laws and the new institutions that will make this new medium safe for democracy. That is not the case in Facebook. Facebook is a corporation with a very specific economic logic that has to extract behavioral data at scale.
Okay.
And the way they do that is to drive engagement.
But you know,
and
you know better than I do that Donald Trump's fans just say this kind of movement or move will embolden him. He will always find a way to talk to the millions of people that still support him, and it will be Facebook that's left out in the cold and not Donald Trump.
Well, I don't know who's saying that, but that is not a formulation I would agree with. Look, what the situation today does not deprive Mr. Trump of his freedom of speech. That is a profound misunderstanding. Mr. Trump can go anywhere that he is welcome, and he can say whatever he wants to say. He can stand in Hyde Park Corner and say what he wants to say. His freedom of speech is intact. What has changed is that Facebook is not a public sphere where free speech is welcome, because the idea in a public sphere is that the best ideas rise to the top.
Yeah.
Facebook is an economic juggernaut with very specific economic imperatives. They need to have a lot of engagement in order to extract a lot of data.
Shashanah?
And that means that they amplify the worst information, the most corrupt information, the most bizarre and inflammatory
Shashanah Zubov,
information.
We're out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you. That is all from us for tonight. But before we go, we wanted to mark the death of Nick Kamen, the model and singer, who's died aged 59. We wanted to find some footage of him that you wouldn't have seen, maybe singing or something, but we kept returning to one thing, that laundrette, those Levi's, those boxers. We know